Hello, my name is Emily. I'm with the Jersey City Free Public Library, and I'm a youth services librarian. And today we're going to be talking about story times. So thank you for joining us today. So we're going to go over the basics about how to plan a story time. I'm not an expert on story time, but it's something I really enjoy doing. It's one of my favorite parts of the job as a youth services librarian. And I find it helpful to plan in preparation for giving a story time. I'm someone, I get nervous speaking in front of people, and being able to plan is something that is helpful. So I want to share some best practices. And what we'll discuss today is helpful for story times, but even just with reading with your child, we have some great tips on how we can get the most of learning um, reading books and learning with your child. So we're going to go over that. So I'm excited. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to get started. Thanks. Hello. So we're going to get started. So come join me with how to plan a story time. So we'll go through the magical land of story time planning together. I have a short agenda for us today. We're going to be discussing 4 different topics within planning for a story time. We're going to be talking about selecting books, how to structure a story time, incorporating early literacy tips, and promoting diversity. Okay, so the first item is selecting books for a story time. So one of the most important things to keep in mind for book selection is to know your audience. You're going to want to select books that are developmentally appropriate for your child or children. So for example, babies love high contrast books where they're really able to clearly see the illustrations. Babies also love pictures of other babies, so that's something to keep in mind. With toddlers, books that have clear illustrations with 1 to 2 sentences per page, so it's easy to follow. And for preschoolers and school age children, you could select books that are more narrative, that have more of a story, that are a little richer in vocabulary and humor. At that age, kids are able to pick up on humor a little bit more, so you could pick books that have that as well. Also, big, clear illustrations. This is especially important where we are now with the virtual space. You don't want to have a book with tiny things that kids aren't able to really see. So having big, clear illustrations, students won't be climbing over each other to see the pictures, and it's just a more pleasurable experience for story time. Also, I love selecting books with some sort of interactive element. So this could be a rhyme or a chant or some sort of singable component. For example, in Pete the Cat books with My Four Groovy Buttons, singing. It's fun to do. It engages kids, and it's fun, and it could be a great way to involve the parents and caregivers, and it also helps make the books more memorable. And after story time, kids are able to remember some of the rhymes and songs from the book. So it's a great way to make your story time more engaging. Also, it's important to select books with diverse characters. We're going to talk a little bit about this later on in the presentation, but we as librarians or storytime facilitators and parents and caregivers to act as educators and to select books that don't just feature animals and animal sounds, but that really showcase our diverse nation and world. So I always think it's important to incorporate diverse characters and also feature BIPOC authors and illustrators. And we'll discuss this a little bit more. Also, you're going to want to select books that you enjoy. Kids are able to pick up on your excitement and enthusiasm. So I always recommend selecting books that you like reading to kids. For example, one of these books, Everybody Says Meow by Constance Lombardo. is one of my favorites. I can't not smile when I read that one. So kids are more engaged when you're excited. So it just leads to a more pleasurable experience for everyone. Lastly, for book selection, don't forget about nonfiction. So fiction is can it be a more of a popular choice with story time. However, nonfiction is great because it really promotes discussion, it lends itself to question asking, and it introduces young people to nonfiction books. So it's important to incorporate those in your story time as well. Great. Thank you. We'll move on to our next topic. Okay, so we'll move on to structuring a story time. So this is kind of the skeleton of what goes into a story time, the activities, and what you do. So I recommend, especially when starting out with a story time, to use some sort of planning sheet. I have an example of what that looks like on my next slide. Um, and to the right on this PowerPoint, we have different activities um, that go into a story time. So at the top and at the bottom, we have a welcome song and a goodbye song. So those are the bookends, if you will, of a story time. So I always recommend starting off with a welcome song. It engages the children, makes them feel welcomed and loved. And when children feel that way, they're more open to learning and development. So it's a critical part of the story time. So it's good to always welcome them. And then with a goodbye song to round out the experience of story time and make it a very pleasurable experience for them. So I always recommend starting with a welcome song and a goodbye song. The other squares are different activities that you can do in your story time. So it depends on the length of your program. And some of these, I recommend doing a couple times within your story time. And it's depending on what you like. So books, for example, you always want to incorporate books. Finger plays. Finger plays are different activities with your hands. Um, it engages them, develops those fine motor skills. Um, so you can incorporate those. Movement activities, those are things like egg shakers or dancing scarves. You can incorporate some props, things to really get those wiggles out because children we know are very energetic, and it's always good to not just have story time just be a time where you sit and listen, but move around and have fun. Songs are obviously very fun and helpful for development of children. So you're going to want to sing songs. And also there's flannel stories. So flannel stories are, if you have a felt board with different pieces, they can be a great way to visualize stories. You can even make them interactive and have children interact with them. And puppets, if puppets are your thing, and if you're good with voices, puppets can be a really fun way to engage the storytime group as well. So moving forward here at the Jersey City Library, we're creating these videos, and we hope to have them explore the more world of props in story time. So that's something that's coming soon. Also, things to keep in mind that repetition is a key component of early learning. So kids like hearing songs that they know. So even though you may seem like you're singing the same thing, it's always helpful. It helps them, their brains develop. So I always recommend having elements of your story time that are well known. It's like going to a concert. You want to hear the classics, not necessarily the new songs. So repetition, you're always going to have elements that children are familiar with. The Wheels on the Bus, and other songs, Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes. Those are all classics, and they really are engaging for kids. Just another idea to keep in mind. So I mentioned planning, and it is helpful to plan, but I also recommend being flexible and to take the temperature of the group. So if you're doing story time and you feel that you're kind of losing the audience, kids are rolling around or not really being as engaged, to maybe do a movement activity or do something like a lift the flap book or pop-up book, something to really to engage. So you do want to plan, but you also want to be flexible and to know when to kind of try things. If a book is not really working, you certainly don't have to continue with that. Um, you can move on to the next activity. So here is a um, planning sheet. So this is taken from Jaybrary. If you're not familiar, Jaybrary is a terrific resource. It's one of my favorites for story time. So it's jaybrary.com. And they have so many resources on books and songs and professional development for educators, librarians, and also parents as well. So I highly recommend visiting that website. And here's just a planning activity. Early literacy tip, which is something that I'm going to talk about in the next portion of this presentation. And it has a space for listing the books, if you want to do puppets or flannel activities, and different songs and movement activities as well. So having this kind of can give you more confidence when you do your story time in front of a group. And it's also helpful in the future, if you're pressed for time, to have a little structure before you get started can give you some more peace of mind as well. Okay, moving along, we're going to discuss adding early literacy tips to your story time. So this is a critical part of why we do story times. We want to help with the development of our children and in our communities. So incorporating these is a critical component of story time. It's why we do it. So I always felt in the early days of doing story time that it disrupted the flow to kind of engage with a tip. But I'm going to share with you some little tricks that I use because it is important and it helps explain the why of why we're doing things, and it also helps caregivers after story time because they know why they're doing things with their children, and it gives them ideas to do things on their own outside of story time. So there are a lot of resources for what to say during a story time. So, if you're nervous about what to say, I recommend doing a little research on some different talking points that you can use. And when it comes to sharing them in your group, I recommend to incorporate them when you're doing an activity. So, for example, I have here, so if you're about to sing a song, you can say something like, singing is not only fun, but it helps children to hear the smaller syllables in words. You can sing songs throughout the day, for example, when brushing teeth or getting ready for bed. So this gives parents and caregivers ideas for what they can do outside of story time to help with their children's development. And so the 5 practices of early literacy include read, talk, write, sing, and play. So you can provide different tips on these topics. Other ones, for example, using dancing scarves in story time. They're a fun activity, but using them also helps develop those fine motor skills that we have in our hands, and that will later on help when children are ready to hold a pencil and to write. So those are different talking points that you can use. So when doing early literacy tips in Storytime, it's something that is very helpful to plan before because it's something that can be forgotten during a story time. So I always like to write it down. And having those talking points that I know that I have to say will make it easier to share. So it's something in the previous slide with the um, planning sheet, there was a big box for early literacy tips. So um, thank you. We'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so the fourth and final topic of today's discussion on how to plan a story time will be promoting diversity. So this is a critical part of story time planning. So it's something I'd like to stress in this little PowerPoint. So I mentioned in the first topic, it is important to select books by BIPOC authors and illustrators, Black, Indigenous people of color. So the publishing industry has a long way to go when it comes to representing BIPOC authors and illustrators. So it's important to select books by authors and illustrators, and also books that have diverse characters. Kids learn best when they see themselves reflected in books and stories. So it is important to feature characters in books with different skin colors, religions, nationalities, different family structures. All of that is important to include in your book selection. So a lot of ways to promote diversity is with the books that we choose. Also, I recommend selecting books that can feature multiple languages. So it's great to expose children to different languages, and kids who speak these languages, they feel comfortable in story time if their language is represented. Here I have a picture of Angela Dominguez, How Do You Say, Como Se Dice? So it is a bilingual book that features Spanish phrases. So it's a great way to incorporate Spanish in your story time with a book. You can also do it through song. So I love singing, and a great way to incorporate other languages is through song. Mama Lisa is a website that features songs from a lot of countries around the world. And it's a simple way to incorporate language. And you can start with a welcome and goodbye song in another language. For example, one I like to use is um, we wave and say ni hao, we wave and say ni hao, we say ni hao to all our friends, we wave and say ni hao. So it's a great way to expose students to another language, in this case, Chinese Mandarin. And it's very simple, and yeah, it's great. The last idea I want to discuss is to incorporate diversity all year round, not just for holidays and special occasions. It's something that should be in the forefront of your mind when you plan every story time. Great. So this was just a little bit of an introduction about how to plan for a story time. I hope it was helpful. I certainly love to talk about it. So my name is Emily. Here is my email address. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns about today's presentations, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.